I thought this painting was nearly finished, but then I realised I'd made a mistake that was about to ruin the entire piece. In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint broadleaf trees and create dramatic lighting effects, and also exactly what went wrong with this painting with the foreground tree and how I was able to fix the problem using better colour temperature choices. I'm painting on a 20-inch by 24-inch Belgium linen stretcher that's oil primed. This painting is inspired by a place called Arrowtown in southern New Zealand, and I was really captivated by the stunning autumn light on one of my visits there. What I love about this location is all the deciduous trees that produce beautiful colours in autumn. And I'd been meaning to paint this scene for years, so now I finally decided to do it. So I did some prior planning with this. There was some sketches and a colour study, and then my actual painting. Now I'm painting in oils here, and the brand of paint I'm using is Blue Ridge Oils. If you want to get some, I've put a link in the description box below. And I'm using a Craft Geek tripod easel to mount my painting on as I paint. It's ideal for small studio spaces and plein air painting. So if you want to get one, I've put a link in the description box below. One of the first things I do with all of my landscape paintings is I paint the dark values and shadows first. So here, the darkest elements in the scene is this willow tree that's in the very foreground. And I've used a mix of ultramarine blue with a little yellow ochre. So it just produces a nice dark tone that has a slight green cast to it and is not overly saturated. I'm also using the biggest brushes I have, which are number 10 bristle flat brushes, because whenever I start a painting I try and use the biggest brushes that I can get away with. The shadows also have a slight green cast to them as well. So I'm focusing on my darkest values. Now as I move into the distance, those shadows are going to be getting lighter, so I've added a little bit of titanium white into my mix. Now whenever I paint, I always think in terms of value, and value is how light or dark your subject is. And the general rule is we'll find our darkest darks in the foreground and our lightest lights. Then as landforms recede, darks aren't as dark and lights aren't as light. So if we keep this in mind, we can create depth and distance in our paintings. One of the other things is trees tend to be some of the darkest values in the landscape, especially when they're growing as part of a woodland or a forest, because there's lots of occlusion shadows. So right now I'm getting in my dark values here, although I've increased the saturation of some of these greens here, mainly using combinations of yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, a little cadmium yellow medium, a small amount of cobalt teal, titanium white and alizarin crimson. Now when I block in a painting, I don't think about detail at all. I want loose gestural painterly brush marks. And then once it's dry, later on then I can start adding detail, and I can go as detailed or as loose as I like. In this case with this painting, I didn't want to go overly detailed, and really I was just letting the brush do the work and almost letting the painting decide itself how it wanted to be painted. Now here I'm painting the cloud shadows in the background. I still consider this as part of my darks, even though sky and clouds are generally much lighter in the landscape. For the cloud shadows I've used a mix of ultramarine blue with a little burnt sienna, titanium white and alizarin crimson. Now once those cloud shadows and the shadows in the background, the trees and the reflections in the water were added, I then started to paint the areas in light, and this was the trees in the midground. And this is one of the main features in the painting. The river in the foreground is going to help lead the eye towards these trees here, forming an S composition. This is one of the easiest compositions to use in your landscape paintings. And if you'd like to learn more about composition, check out my video on 3 simple composition formulas. Now when it comes to the colour mixing here for the trees, I wanted a mix of some autumn colours because some of those trees are starting to turn yellow, but many of them are still green, so I wanted to get some of those rich vibrant greens in there. So I used combinations of yellow ochre with cadmium yellow medium, a little cadmium red light and titanium white for the more yellow areas of the trees. Then I just introduced more ultramarine blue, some phthalo green, some cobalt teal and burnt sienna for the green areas, also titanium white. I was using varying mixtures of these colours, so it wasn't just one set colour. Generally when I mix my colours I use broken colour where I'm not mixing my colours together thoroughly so that I can see some of the individual colours from the paint tubes coming through on my painting. Now if you remember, I said when I block in my paintings I try and use the biggest brushes that I can get away with, and I'm not concerned with detail, and at this point in the painting the block-in stage was complete. It looks pretty ugly at this stage, but I've got a good foundation for the whole painting and a base to work from. So what I did was I was starting to add details to the trees. So this is part of the modelling phase where I'm working on individual zones of the painting. One of the things I wanted to do with the trees was to feather the ends of the tree canopies to make sure that it looks like there's an abundance of leaves. One of the things that artists get really tangled up in when it comes to painting trees is trying to paint every single leaf, especially from the get-go, and it actually makes painting trees really difficult. So the way I paint my trees is to treat them as masses and just use big bold brush marks to begin with, then add layers of paint and just slowly build up some of the leaves, but I'm not painting every single leaf. Most of the time I'm just painting the few suggestions of leaves. So what I've done here is I've been painting the reflected light in this tree using combinations of yellow ochre with ultramarine blue, some cadmium yellow medium, some titanium white, cobalt teal and alizarin crimson, but making sure the value of the tree is pretty dark because it's in shadow. Now having the dark foreground here as well as the dark background is really going to emphasize these trees that are in the full light in the midground. And here it was back to painting the trees in the midground, and again I was using the same colours that I was using in the block-in stage, but this time I was making the value of some of these colours lighter than the previous layer. So one of the things you want to do with your painting if you really want to create depth is to start off darker and then slowly build up those lighter layers of paint and then save your lightest values until the very end. You don't want to go too light to start with, otherwise you risk having a flat looking painting. So just like the willow tree in the foreground, with these midground trees I wasn't going overly detailed. I was more just focusing on brushwork, the darks, the half tones and the lights that are in the trees. So here what I'm doing now is I'm re-emphasizing some of these dark shadows that are being cast by the trees. I'm still using a bristle flat brush for this, and I'm just sculpting the edges of the trees with the shadow mix. And having shadows in the landscape, especially in trees, really helps to convey their form and convey realistic three-dimensional looking trees. So I left the trees in the midground for the moment. There's still way more work to be done to them. And then I started painting the trees that are in the background. Now there's tons of trees growing on the side of this hill, but I didn't want to be getting bogged down in detail there. So really what I've done is I've painted the suggestion of lots of trees. Now as I was painting this, I could see a couple of errors in the composition. I didn't like where one of those Lombardy poplars was sat, so I just moved it as well. It's also helping to provide a bit of a focal area in the painting. Now back to the hill in the background, and one of the things I was doing here was painting the darker shadows in there. There's many occlusion shadows as well. And keeping in mind, because it's further away, that the value of these shadows is going to be a little lighter than compared with the occlusion shadows that's in the grass and the willow trees in the foreground. So that's helping to create more depth. And again, I'm just focusing on brushwork here and just getting my colours and values correct. Another thing about greens as well is as they go into the distance, they start to lose their intensity. So for those greens in the background, I'm using a bit more of a desaturated green than compared with the greens that I'm using in the foreground. So as I work through the painting, I'm always checking my tonal values and colours and just correcting them and adding to them as I move along the painting. Now, if you're struggling with trees or any other aspect of landscape painting, I've got something that can really help. I run an online art school where I teach artists just like you to take their painting to the next level. We've got comprehensive tutorials, live Zoom classes where you can ask questions in real time, and a whole community of artists supporting each other. The goal is simple: get your artwork to a standard you'd be proud to hang on your wall or even sell. Right now I'm giving away a 7-day free trial to my art school. The link is in the description box below. If you want to quickly improve your art, then what are you waiting for? Now then, back to the painting. Now, even though the focus of this video is mainly on painting the trees, I'll just give you some tips for painting the water. So the water here, there's some still parts of it, but there's also some faster flowing water, and generally the river here is pretty shallow. So what I did first was painted the reflection, so that was the shadow areas to begin with, and then the light areas from where those midground trees are reflecting. Another way to create reflections is to pull your brushwork downwards, so downwards brush marks, and that will create more convincing looking reflections. And then once you've done that, you can start painting ripples over the top. And that's what I've done in general. So the ripples here, they're mostly reflecting the sky, so I was using a sky mix of ultramarine blue with a tiny bit of burnt sienna, some titanium white and a little alizarin crimson. Just like with the trees, I started off darker and then I added lighter tone. I was using a synthetic filbert brush so I could get some finer detail to convey the moving water. Then there was back to other elements in the scene that needed painting, such as the banks of the river, which again was in shadow. At this point of the painting, the tree in the foreground was dry, so what I wanted to do now was start building out the tree canopy. I already painted in the main stems and branches. This was just a combination of ultramarine blue with some burnt sienna, and that creates a near black, and then also painted some reflected light. But I was building up the tree canopy with varying green mixes that I'd used previously. But the main important thing was to make sure the value was lighter than the previous layer, but dark enough that the tree still looks like it's in shadow. Then once I'd done that, I painted some of these tall grasses that were in the foreground here. And to build up the grass, I used a similar approach as I did with the willow tree, i.e. starting off darker and then just building up more layers of paint. Now I'm someone that doesn't like getting too bogged down in detail, and I don't want to be painting every single blade of grass, so I just prefer to imply it by pushing the paint upwards with my brush in the direction that the grass is growing. Now at this point in the painting, I was thinking to myself, I can see the finish line here, and I was adding more detail to the midground trees, adding some lighter tone, building up those lighter layers of paint in preparation for saving my lightest values, which I would add at the end of the painting. So I did more work on the water, just emphasizing some more of these reflections and adding more to the trees in the midground. Another thing to note here is that I'm using smaller brushes compared to what I was using in the blocking stage, and was also starting to use combinations of bristle flat brushes and synthetic flat brushes as well for finer detail. So I was adding lighter areas in the tree's canopy, but then also restating the dark values, sculpting those trees and emphasizing their forms to communicate this strong sun with the shadows casting on the trees behind it. So remember, having shadows in your landscapes and your trees is just going to make things easier to paint and also make it easier to convey a three-dimensional looking landscape. Now I was adding more details to the trees here, especially in the foreground, but this is where I started to notice some problems. I was to the point where I was thinking, yep, I'm getting this painting finished and I'm just adding the last ripples here to the water. But the more I looked at it, I really wasn't happy with the colour of the willow tree in the foreground. Now the camera doesn't show it so well here, but those greens looked a little bit muddy for my liking, mainly because I was trying to communicate the autumn colours as well in the trees, but it just wasn't working too well. So I got to a point where I was thinking, what do I do about these trees? I let my painting sit for a while. I was looking at it in different lighting, and in the end I just wasn't happy with it at all, and I decided, nah, this has got to be repainted. I think one of the mistakes that I made here was I deviated from my colour study too much, because in my colour study I made the willow tree in the foreground still look quite green, whereas when I came to paint it I added too many golden and rusty tones in the tree's canopy, and it just made it look a bit muddy. I thought the whole painting just wasn't looking good as it was, so I made the tough decision to rework the tree in the foreground. I knew it was going to take me a little while to repaint it, but I think it was worth it in the end. So at this point I'd already started adding to the tree's canopy here, and what I did was I started adding some cooler greens. So green's obviously a cool colour anyway, but I was adding more cobalt teal and phthalo green into my mix, alizarin crimson, but just generally making it look more green and less muddy. I was layering on the leaves here with a synthetic flat brush. At this point in the painting it was complete and I was much happier with the end result. So I hope you enjoyed this video and it inspires you to paint trees. Don't forget to check out my art school if you'd like to level up your painting. Also, if you like my painting style and would like some artworks for your walls, I have a range of prints and original artworks on my website at samuelerfineart.com. Again, I'll put the link in the description box below. Lastly, if you'd like to learn more about painting trees, then check out this video here. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.